Hi everyone, my name is Abdul and I'm a neuroscientist. And today the podcast is very different than the usual ones, like which are mostly on psychoanalysis. But today our topic is on archetypal astrology and its impact on psychological processing. And today Becca Tarnas has joined us. She is a expert astrological counselor. And thank you, Becca, for joining me. And it would be better if you introduce yourself because it would be much better and people would know about you. Thank you for joining
Absolutely.
me.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's lovely to meet you. As you mentioned, my name is Becca Tarnas, and I'm a practicing archetypal astrologer.
Hmm.
So I'm a counseling astrologer, meaning I work one-on-one with clients, but I'm also a research astrologer because my background is in academia. I have
Hmm.
a PhD in philosophy and religion, and so through that, I studied the Red Book of Carl Gustav Jung. So one of
Hmm.
the founders of depth psychology,
Yep.
particularly the field of analytical psychology, better known now just simply as Jungian psychology.
Hmm.
And the that designation archetypal for the particular kind of astrology I do focuses on it's almost like a method or a perspective uh, on astrology, and really arose out of modern consciousness research.
Hmm.
So in that research, I can give you a little bit of the background, because of course
Hmm.
astrology has been around for as long as we can remember in multiple forms, in coming from so many different cultures. Like, we can't even really speak of astrology. There's more astrologies.
Hmm.
And and yes, there's something that's kind of unifying them. It's obviously working with the placements of the planets and so forth, um, and their relative position to the stars. But um, archetypal astrology is particularly connected to Jungian depth psychology and archetypal psychology,
Hmm.
as defined particularly by James Hillman. But then it has deep roots in Platonic philosophy, for example, and an understanding of what an archetype is. An archetype is basically a universal that stands behind a particular.
Hmm.
And one uh, example that I often like to give for what an archetype is, if you think of beauty, beauty is something that we can recognize
Hmm.
in a flower or in a landscape or in someone's face or in a painting or in someone's clothing. All of those are very different particulars, but the specifics, um, they come through in, we can recognize beauty as coming through all of those very different particulars, those
Hmm.
particular expressions. And yet we know there's some kind of core behind it. They share or they participate in this archetype of beauty. Um, you can give a more, like a simpler example, for example, of a cat. All cats participate in, you could say, the archetype of catness.
Hmm.
Um, that's kind of a more simple expression. Beauty, I think, carries that complexity. And of course, archetypes are something that were central to Jung's psychology.
Hmm.
He really saw them as the persons or the figures of the human psyche. And what astrology does is it has it recognizes that correlated with each one of the planets is a particular archetype or a
Hmm.
particular set of meanings. And that if you look at where the planets were at the moment someone was born, and the relationships that are between those planets, like
Hmm.
geometrical relationships,
Hmm.
maybe they're opposite each other in the sky, maybe they're next to each other in the sky. Um, based on those combinations,
Mm-hmm.
one can see that the archetypes associated with those planets come through that individual's life in their personality, in their relationships, in more external factors like the kind of work they do, even situations they draw into their lives. So astrology is a very helpful mapping system in terms of coming to understand what the complexes are that we may carry within our psyches. And in terms of, because of course the work of psychotherapy is to
Mm-hmm.
identify those complexes. And we kind of do that through the process of dialogue with the therapist and seeing all these interlinking patterns. Well, astrology can do the same thing. It can give you this symbolic map that points toward the same information. And so it pairs very well with psychology because it already gives you a sense of what those underlying psychological complexes might be and how you might be able to work with them as well.
Mm-hmm. So that was a great explanation, even for the layman people, on archetypes and archetypal
Mm,
astrology. As you said that each of the planet carries archetypal energy, right? So how do we get to know that? Like for a very rational person, right? So
yeah.
that's the question that pretty much comes in the mind. Like, how do we know that those planets carry some energy? What's the evidence, or what's the rational proof, or how do we know that? Like, for a person to comprehend that.
Such a good question, such an important question to ask too, because there's a reason that astrology had to be kind of rejected by the rational modern
Hmm.
mind. It doesn't fit at all within a materialist perspective.
Hmm.
And so just to be very clear, I'm not saying that the planets, the physical planets, are causing by any means the actions to unfold or the events or
Hmm.
personalities to unfold on Earth. It's not a physical causation. It's not like there are gravity waves or something at that level. The idea, and I'll share a metaphor that is often used by some of my teachers, of the positions of the planets in the solar system are like the hands on a clock. And so when you look at a clock and you say, oh, it's 2 p.m., the clock isn't telling you, or excuse me, the clock isn't causing it to be 2 p.m.
Hmm.
It is indicating that it is 2 p.m. And it's the same as with the planets. They are not causing certain events to be. They're simply telling you the quality of time in that moment.
Hmm.
And then regarding how we know which archetypes are associated with which planets,
Hmm.
um, in terms of the 7 ancient planets that are visible to the naked eye, so the sun and the moon, neither of which are technically planets. We call them luminaries in astrology because they illuminate the sky.
Hmm.
And then the 5 planets of Mercury and Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn.
Hmm.
So those are visible to the naked eye, and the meanings associated with them are meanings that have been associated with them for millennia. And when we look to the naming of the particular planets, now the names that I use happen to come out of the Greco-Roman tradition because that's my particular background. But of course, other astrologies will be using other names,
Hmm.
other languages for those planets. And that there's a mythic connection between the archetype associated with the planet and a kind of deity. So to continue with that example I was using before of the archetype of beauty, the
Hmm.
planet Venus is associated with the archetype of beauty, of love, of
Hmm.
romance, desire, attraction,
Hmm.
sensuality, sexuality, but also the beautiful, artistic, aesthetic side of that archetype. You can see, like, I'm using all these different words to describe
Hmm.
something, but I'm kind of circumscribing. You can feel intuitively the core that's there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's something Jung would often talk about, that we can only roughly circumscribe an archetype. It's like I can
Mm-hmm.
describe each of the facets, but I
Mm-hmm.
can never fully capture in language the whole. But you have a sense of what I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking
Yeah.
about.
So as you said that, like, it's
Yeah.
very much related to like the myths, like the Greeks and the Romans, right? So I heard someone saying that, but I don't know how much that's true. But I want to bring it on.
Yeah.
Like, do the gods project those energies on the planets? Is this something like that? Because I have
Mm.
heard something like that. But what's the? I don't understand the science behind that, or I'm not
Yeah,
sure how it works. So would you explain that?
absolutely. Well, it's when we are talking about myths and the names of the gods being associated with the
Mm-hmm.
planets, so Venus as the goddess of love and
Mm-hmm.
beauty, or Saturn as the god of death, or all, Mars as the god of war, that
Mm-hmm.
is the mythic association. And so in terms of describing it in that way, we have to kind of go back in our understanding of consciousness
Mm-hmm.
to a time period when that was the worldview. That was how people saw the world. So it's almost like you have to imagine yourself, I'll call it like the sympathetic imagination. You have to
Mm-hmm.
imagine what it is like to be a person who views the world through this mythic lens. And so stay with me here, because I'm going to take you a little bit on a journey through
No problem.
time.
Mm-hmm.
So we've gone back into this mythic consciousness. And according to some scholars who study, you could say, like an evolution of consciousness, just to be clear, that's not a hierarchy by any means of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
just simply a development of consciousness. And so there's a time where human beings have a very mythic relationship to the world. And
Mm-hmm.
it seems very likely that the way the world was viewed is that the physical matter and more like ensouled psychical spiritual material,
Mm-hmm.
they're perceived at once. And an example that I often like to give of this, you can trace this through language. One of my favorite scholars is this man, Owen Barfield. And he did this. He traced language to see how in really ancient languages, such as Latin or ancient Greek or Sanskrit, the words carry multiple meanings that are all metaphorically related
Mm-hmm.
to each other. So the example I would give is the Latin word spiritus. Spiritus now into English translates into spirit or breath or wind, and I think a few other translations as
Mm-hmm.
well. And so now we today in our consciousness, we see those as separate words. Spirit means one thing, breath means something else, wind means something else.
Mm-hmm.
But we can see how, let's say we were poets, they're metaphorically related to each other. And so I might talk about the spirit of the wind, or
Mm-hmm.
how, the breath is the spirit in the body. And what Owen Barfield's argument is that we, according to the ancient speaker of that word, coming back
Mm-hmm.
to that more mythic consciousness, when they say that word spiritus, they mean all of those meanings. The wind is the spirit,
Mm-hmm.
is the breath. There's no metaphor here. It's just all one unified meaning. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the same form of consciousness that could look up and see the planet Venus shining like a diamond in the sky and think, of course, that is the goddess of beauty. Not just think it as a metaphor or making meaning out of it, but actually deeply perceiving that. So
Mm-hmm.
that is where the meanings of the planets initially arise. But then here's the extraordinary mystery of the world, is that as that form of mythic consciousness moves forward, and there begins to be a bit of a separation between the physical and the
Mm-hmm.
psychical qualities. They're kind of coming apart in our consciousness, and so we have our own interior experience, and there's an external objective experience. That's about the time that astrology begins to be codified. So the rules of astrology, now we're still talking about like ancient astrology here, begin to be set down. And it's almost like a map to be able to keep that connection between the mythic and the physical.
Mm-hmm.
And those practices, those astrological practices, have been passed down for many, many centuries. Obviously, they've evolved too. But the extraordinary thing is that they still work. Because when we look in someone's birth chart and we take those ancient meanings associated with the planets, we see that depending what their Venus is an aspect with, we have an understanding of what kind of love life they will have, what kind of person they'll be attracted to, the kind of art and aesthetic they will be drawn to. Not, and this is an important part of the kind of astrology I do, and I'm owning that because there's, again, different astrologies. There are other kinds of astrologies that are more concretely predictive than what I do. What I do is more archetypally predictive. So I can speak to the range of archetypal meaning that would be associated with a particular aspect. And so here comes the other side, which is simply research. Looking at many, many charts, birth charts of individuals, many different historical events. So most astrologers you meet are going to have a good understanding of history because they're looking through history and looking at correlations between planetary movements. And so those ancient meanings, they're not just assumed, they're also reaffirmed by every astrologer who comes in, learns the practice, and basically gathers the research. And there's really important methodologies for being able to do accurate astrological research. So it's very much not anything goes, but really being able to trace those meanings. Now, I was just talking about the ancient planets, but of course, some other planets have been discovered in using technology in the modern era. And the three planets that I work with the most in my practice, the outer planets, are Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So Uranus was discovered in 1781, then Neptune in 1846, and finally Pluto in 1930. Now, where do we get the meanings associated with them? It's not as simple as just giving a mythic name to a planet and then saying that's what it means. It's more of a process of research and intuition. Noticing how this, like, is there a gap in terms of what, meanings could be coming through? And then you look and you see, oh, are there consistent correlations for that in history, in people's birth charts, and so on. And so one example regarding the two outer planets and the meanings that astrologers over the last several centuries have come to ascribe to them. An example is looking through world history and seeing, well, every time the planet Uranus and the planet Pluto come together in alignment, it seems to correlate with periods of major revolutionary change happening all around the world. And so we're actually right now just coming to the end of the most recent alignment of Uranus with Pluto. This is the last year. 2020 is the last year of this alignment. Started in late 2007. And it's been, I think most people would agree, it's been a pretty eruptive, revolutionary...
Of the Pluto, you said, right?
Uranus and Pluto, yes.
But the Pluto isn't ending on 2024, or is it this year for the Pluto?
Well, this is just the cycle between Uranus and Pluto coming into alignment with each other. And which alignment were you asking about?
So about the Pluto and Jupiter, like...
Right. Jupiter and Pluto are in alignment just for this year, 2020. They're in what's called a conjunction, where they're next to each other. And Saturn is in there too. So we have Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto all together.
So just for the ease, would you just tell us what conjunction means in astrology, like with the planets?
So a conjunction is one of 5 major aspects. And the conjunction is kind of the easiest to visualize because it's literally when 2 or more planets are next to each other visibly in the sky. So the new moon is an example of a conjunction between the sun and the moon. If you stay up, not terribly late, but later, you can look up and see moving across the night sky right now, Jupiter and Saturn in a conjunction. If you had a telescope, you could see Pluto between them. But Jupiter and Saturn are very bright, especially Jupiter. It's the one that just pops out of the sky. And so a conjunction is one of those 5 major aspects.
So do those planets carry like high archetypal energy when they're really aligned with each other?
Exactly. It's like the qualities that are associated with each one of those planets, they combine, they act on each other. It's like they're in dialogue with each other. So to give an example, Saturn, the archetype associated with Saturn has to do with the endings of things, with structure, hard work, boundaries, loss, difficulty, pain, suffering, death, mortality. So you can tell Saturn's a pretty heavy archetype.
Exactly.
It's got a lot of
and
weight,
that's what we have been
gravity.
seeing in 2020.
Yes.
I mean, even if we don't have some kind of rational proofs for astrology, let's say that, but still, when the results come, we have to believe. That's the astonishing thing.
It's amazing. I mean, just this particular alignment between Saturn and Pluto. So just to give a little brief description of the Plutonic archetype, Pluto intensifies and deepens and pushes to extremes, whatever it
Death and
touches.
rebirth, I believe.
Exactly. Death and rebirth, destruction and creation. It's like, the volcano erupting, or the phoenix dying into the flames and being reborn.
Is it also like the Dionysus energy?
It's like Dionysus. It's like Hades. It's like Kali. It's like Pele in the Hawaiian tradition. So all of these different kind of death, rebirth, destruction, creation figures that are very instinctual, intense, libidinal. There's a wildness. That's the Dionysian part. There's a wildness to Pluto. It's like the elemental powers of nature. So you bring that powerful primal intensity together with Saturn, which is going to be like a container and a structure trying to hold that intensity in. And you have a situation of kind of intense crisis that it feels like it's both trying to boil over and be held in at the same time, like a pressure cooker. And that feeling, many people this year have been feeling it, of being intensely under pressure.
Yep.
And then finally, Jupiter is also part of the mix. And Jupiter tends to amplify and to make bigger whatever it touches. It crowns king or queen what it touches. And so what do we see this year? But that Saturn-Pluto, which has been in the sky for the last couple years, creating multiple crises in so many parts of the world in so many different forms. And then Jupiter comes in right at the beginning of 2020 and crowns it. And what's the virus called? The coronavirus. Which means crown. And a virus also, it's very plutonic in the sense that it's wild, it's from nature, and it brings in Saturn, the possibility.
Also bring boundaries, closure of borders, Saturn.
Totally. Close your borders, close your houses, the whole sense with all the lockdowns of being imprisoned and trapped. And so just archetypally, that's kind of enough talking about this year. But if we look back through history, every time Saturn and Pluto come together, it tends to correlate with some kind of major crisis, such as the First World War, the Second World War. The Cold War started under a Saturn-Pluto alignment. 9/11 happened under the two Saturn-Pluto alignments ago, the last opposition of those two. We see epidemics correlate with it, like the AIDS epidemic under the last conjunction in the early 80s. The bubonic plague many centuries ago started in China under a Saturn-Pluto alignment, moved to Europe under the next Saturn-Pluto alignment. So many correlations every time these two planets come together. Big economic crashes too tend to correlate with it, because there's a scarcity that comes in, having to make do with fewer resources. It tests our ability to survive in multiple forms.
So like on a collective level of grand scheme by God, if I say, So what would the wisdom behind Pluto and Saturn, and how, like, me or anyone as an individual can actually integrate those archetypal energies? Because it's totally on the free will, right? Either we do, or they would just they carry high archetypal energy, they might possess us. So what would you say in this aspect?
Such an important question. And again, when we look at that historical context, so often what stands out are the horrible things that happened, the wars, the diseases, the terrorist attacks, etc. But what also happens is this profoundly strong moral response that's developed. There is a capacity for a real and deep, lasting transformation to take place. And those are also qualities associated with Pluto and Saturn. Pluto, being that archetype of death and rebirth, has to do with real transformation. Saturn is what brings in that reality principle and makes it enduring and lasting through time. So there's a quality about Saturn Pluto periods where we're really called to use some Jungian language, to do deep inner work, do shadow work, to look at the hidden parts of ourselves, the repressed parts of ourselves, the things that we wish weren't us. And often, as happens under Saturn Pluto periods, we project them outward. We project them onto people or cultures that we're afraid of and say, you're wrong, you're evil, you're bad. Rather than realizing, oh, maybe there's something in myself that I'm afraid of that I'm not looking at. And so I'm putting it out on someone else. And then you get all this horrible division and blaming and so on. So at a personal level, and I think at like a smaller scale, like family or community level, and definitely at the therapeutic level, Saturn Pluto periods are about going into that material, like really working on your problems. And that is hard work. I don't think anybody this year is going through, even if you're kind of attempting to do everything right, it's not an easy process. But that's what shadow work is. It's hard work.
So, if I'm not wrong, there's a shadow side of each planet or each archetypal energy. So, how would that manifest if, like, let's say for Pluto, right? So, people with Plutonian heat, would they hate like the conventional side? Because they are very much believing in death and rebirth. So, would their shadow part would be something very conventional, or what would be that?
Well, so I kind of want to give a two-part answer to this, because each archetype on its own has a kind of shadow side and a more noble expression, and then certain qualities that we could just call neutral too. And then when they're combined, there can also be like one part is the shadow, one part is the more of, again, the life enhancing or the noble expression. And so we have to recognize that this is kind of coming, there's a shadow side of the archetype itself, and then there's also the shadow side of how an individual can express that, which is going to be very specific to them. So the shadow side of Pluto, it's funny that you ask about that, because so much of Pluto can be a shadow side, because it is kind of the archetype of the shadow. And so we almost have to look more, well, what is its nobility? Because it's very easy to talk about the shadow side of Pluto. It's corruption, it's destruction, it's the underworld in every sense, the mythic underworld, the religious underworld, the criminal underworld, the urban underworld, the sexual underworld. So you can see that Pluto itself carries that quality of shadow, but then it's also, here's actually one example I love from Pluto, because it's power. Now, power can be power over or empowerment. And you can see how power over, like power struggles, power dynamics, carries more of a shadow side. But empowerment, I mean, that's something that every individual is hopefully working toward. Personal empowerment, relational empowerment, community empowerment, both are Pluto. both indeed are power.
Mm-hmm.
But one has more of this life-enhancing expression and the other doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
I think Saturn is actually one of the really clear-cut archetypes when you can see what the shadow side is and what the life-enhancing
Mm-hmm.
potential is. Because Saturn, as you know, you were hearing, it is associated with all of these really difficult things like death, loss, suffering, pain, isolation. But Saturn is also wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
responsibility, commitment, the
More like
ability to...
father archetype, maybe.
Exactly. And even
Mm-hmm.
there, the father archetype can
Mm-hmm.
be both the tyrannical, patriarchal,
Mm-hmm.
domineering father,
Mm-hmm.
or the strong, supportive
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
father that really kind of
Mm-hmm.
holds the safe
Like
container.
constructive criticism. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And criticism is an expression of Saturn. And then
Mm-hmm.
constructive criticism is an
Is the
expression of
positive.
Saturn. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, and every archetype has that. Like Mars, for
Mm-hmm.
example, can be anger and violence.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
anger in itself is another great one where anger can be righteous. It
Mm-hmm.
can arise to...
Assertiveness. Mm-hmm.
It's like the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness,
Mm-hmm.
where we want to cultivate the part of Mars in us that asserts,
Mm-hmm.
I have a right to take up space, to be an individual, to do my work, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to bring it all the way over into the side of aggression or
Mm-hmm.
violence.
Mm-hmm.
This is why one of the best expressions for Mars, it's very
Mm-hmm.
physically embodied. So
Mm-hmm.
athleticism, like getting that what could be aggression or violence out
Mm-hmm.
through physical exercise. And how
Mm-hmm.
often is that something that is, ascribed to someone who's struggling with anger?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why don't you work out more, move some of that energy through your body? What
Mm-hmm.
you're working through is the archetype of Mars. That's what's coming through you.
Mm-hmm. So, like we see that there's much involvement of houses in astrology, like all the, I believe, 12 houses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, how do they differ? Like, it gets so complex for a layman. Like, if a certain planet is, let's say, if Capricorn has Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn, right? In I believe ninth house, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's for me, I know. So because I can tell for myself, I don't know much about things. So how does it they have an impact like by houses? Like if there's in the first house, second, ninth. So.
Well, so there are these multiple parts of the system in
Mhm.
astrology. You have the planets, which
Mhm.
I really see as they're kind of the core of the whole practice. We start with the planets and
Mhm.
then understanding the aspects, the relationships between them. And then, because you mentioned both, we have the signs of the zodiac, and there's 12
Mhm.
of those. And those are, first of all, based on the constellations along the ecliptic, which is just the plane, the orbital plane of the planets in the
Mhm.
solar system, and it's the backdrop of fixed stars there. Now, the signs of the zodiac are a little different than the constellations of the zodiac. That's a
Mhm.
whole deep rabbit hole that we probably shouldn't go down. A lot of
Mhm.
astrologers get into
Mhm.
interesting
Mhm.
dialogues around that. But the important thing to know is that it's a system of 12.
Mhm.
And each sign has 30 degrees in it. That adds up to 360 degrees, which is how many degrees are in a circle. And that's why the birth
Mhm.
chart is always presented as round, or almost always. There are some beautiful ancient charts that are more like geometrical,
Mhm.
square. Anyway, I won't go into that. We'll just stick with the round version.
Mhm.
And then there are also the houses. And the houses are 12 divisions of the sky.
Mhm.
What divides the 6 lower houses from the 12 upper houses is simply the
Mhm.
horizon.
Mhm.
And so in a chart, those 12 places, they're always the same. And then everything moves through that based on the
Mhm.
Earth's rotation. And I know that's kind
Mhm.
of complicated to picture as I'm describing it, but the
So just
houses,
by with the
yeah.
rotation, as you said that, can
Mm-hmm.
we say that like the changes in the houses and the movement of planets or the archetypal energies, that's for the transformation of a person, not so that a person doesn't have a rigid personality, because with that life won't work, right? If even at a psychological level someone has a very rigid personality, so how would they function? So maybe it's like, as you said, that it's like the upper six houses and the lower six houses. So as the movement changes or the planet moves in the next house, right? So it
By
has a different,
transit, yes.
exactly. So it has a different impact on their psyche.
Yes. So the understanding with the houses is that each one of those 12 houses is associated with particular topics. And those are not arbitrarily assigned. They have been recognized to be associated with those 12 places in the sky based on the motion of what's called the diurnal motion, so the rotation of the Earth, in connection to the movement of the planets. So you have one faster motion of the day going this way, and you have a slower motion of the planets going this way. And the interaction of those two sets of motions that give us the meanings or the topics of all the places and how they relate to what's called the ascendant, or where all the planets rise. So one example that I often will kind of enjoy illustrating this with is that the 12th house, which is that area of sky just above the eastern horizon. Now, the topics associated with the 12th house are that which is hidden, what is it can be what's imprisoned, what is kind of kept in the dark. It may be harder to access. Traditionally, it's often associated with enemies, so there's a bit of a negative connotation there too. And now, why is that? Well, that area of sky is the area of sky where, when the sun rises, the stars disappear first. So in terms of that, the stars disappearing, there's actually an obscuring that takes place in that area of sky. And that's where the meanings come from. It is obscured by this brighter light coming from the first house. And so again, all the meanings are taken from those placements. The 10th house, which is the house where, when the sun is there, it's noon. When the sun is in the 4th house, it's midnight. When the sun is in the 7th house, the sun is setting. And so again, the meanings are all taken from that. We could go into great detail about it, but you really start off with that axis. And then the other 8 houses are derived from whether they're falling away from those power positions or moving toward them. An astrologer who's done a lot of wonderful work and presentations on this is Achyuta Bhavadasa. And he's drawing his research from Robert Schmidt, who's an astrologer and a translator of these ancient texts. So I'm getting that information I'm sharing with you from that particular lineage.
Because that was very new thing for me. I was really learning about the houses and the movements, because it pretty much even is understanding for a rational person, because there's always a clash when you tell actually a very critical person about archetypal astrology, because they're always looking for some reasons that what are the reasons behind that, and then how. But actually you explain in a very good way. So like the archetypal energies of all the planets, right? So would you just tell briefly about the archetypal energies assigned to the planets, so that it's easy for people to just like briefly?
Absolutely. So the ones that I work with are the 10. I'll sometimes refer to them as like the classic modern 10, where you have the classic 7 and then the 3 outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So if we begin with the sun is the archetype of the self. It is the center of the identity. It's who we are as an autonomous individual. And so in the birth chart, anything in relationship, any planet in relationship to the sun is going to have a really central role in who we understand ourselves to be. It's the part of us that says, I am, like what we
Mm-hmm.
name ourselves, what we shine as in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of in world transits, when the sun is passing in relation to another planet, it usually highlights, it focuses on, just like the sun does, it illuminates. We see it more clearly. And then the moon, the archetype of the moon is connected to the emotions, the feelings, the body. The moon is our psychosomatic state of being, and it's connected to the home, the family, our childhood experiences, our
Everything very
inner child.
personal. Mm-hmm.
Very personal in an inner kind of relational,
Mm-hmm.
familial way.
Mm-hmm.
Both the sun and the moon have that personal quality, but the
Mm-hmm.
sun more in terms of who we are individually as persons, and the
Mm-hmm.
moon more who we are relationally and in family dynamics. So it's
Mm-hmm.
especially connected to like the mother-child relationship, or the nurturing parental role, nourishment, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Then we move to Mercury, which is the archetype of the mind, the intellect, thinking, learning, speaking, writing, education, institutions of education, how we understand, how we communicate, how we tell
Mm-hmm.
stories, words, language, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then we move to Venus, which is the archetype of the heart, of love, of beauty, of romance, desire. It's, aesthetics, and so on, the artistic. And then we move from Venus to Mars, which is energy, action, the will to do, assertion, aggression, anger, violence, war. It is that warrior or athletic energy. It's like the fire in our blood, our vitality. And then we move to Jupiter, which is expansive, elevating, magnifying. It makes royal, so crowning queen or king, whatever it touches. It has to do with high civilization and with grandeur, with abundance, with riches, with anything that expands or becomes larger. And you can kind of see how these all relate to each other. It's like, as we go through each one, it's like it calls in the next. Like Venus lures in Mars, which is assertive. Jupiter expands and then calls in Saturn, contraction. And Saturn being difficulty, loss, structure, time, tradition, the old, the ancient, what's hard, physical, material, what's heavy, weighted, grounded. It's symbolized by, the structure of our bodies, the skeletal system, the skull, and isn't, the skull as a symbol of death, of endings, of mortality. And that's where the ancient cosmos ends. It ends with Saturn, which makes so much sense. And then, using technology, there's suddenly a breaking of the old cosmos and the discovery of Uranus, which is the archetype of breakthrough, awakening, liberation from the old. It's the trickster. It's the rebel. It's the revolutionary that brings change, new insight, awakening, wonder, awe, the kind of aha moment when you recognize something new. And so it's connected with anything that's innovative, brilliant, technological, genius-oriented. And then we move to Neptune. Neptune, which is the symbol of unity, wholeness, oneness. It merges
Spirituality.
spirituality, religion, the sacred, the numinous. It's watery, so it's flowing and dissolving and merging, and it's connected to the image, the wellspring of images, and all potential and imagination and magic and enchantment and the occult and the esoteric. And then finally we move to Pluto. Pluto, which destroys, which ruptures, which brings new creation out of that destruction, which intensifies, which drives to powerful extremes. It's our instincts, it's our libidinal desire, it's the wild hunting animal. The Pluto is very visceral, so connected to like the bodily fluids, like our innards and blood and feces. And it's everything that civilization rejects and represses and oppresses. And then it gains power in that underworld place because it's been rejected. When I think of Pluto, I think of all the sewer systems under cities, or anything that is hidden or obscured down in the depths of the underworld, like the dragon down in the underworld, coiled in this ferocious power that could be unleashed. So those are the archetypes. That's a quick journey through the 10, at least.
Actually, that was not a quick, but that was really detailed and the most, I would say, understandable even version of all those archetypal energies. Because I try that for all my layman audience, that they actually get enlightened with what we are saying. So I believe that you have explained everything in a very wonderful way. And thank you so much for joining me today. And we are done with the questions. And thank you so much. I'm really honored.
Oh, thank you as well. I'm honored also. And it was so lovely to get to speak with you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Likewise.